session. My name is Ella Whelan. I'm the co-convener of the Battle of Ideas Festival. And delighted to be chairing this session this afternoon. Gross out feminism is the political now to personal. And just before I introduce my speakers, I want to explain the session a little bit because some people have asked me what I meant by gross out feminism is a kind of term that was briefly used in some discussions about contemporary feminism as very much as a positive thing, as something that was to be embraced. The kind of emergence of discussions about things like women's body hair, their menstrual cycles, the very intimate parts of their lives as being inherently political. And the argument was, this is gross out feminism, this is real life, this is what women have to deal with, and so deal with it. And I really wanted to use that as a jumping off point to look at different ways. We've done lots of feminism discussions at the Battle of Ideas previously, to have a look and try and investigate what this new contemporary feminism is about, and perhaps identify whether or not there are generational divides in it, which seem to have become prevalent in relation to the hashtag #MeToo movement, which was, you could argue, very much about women's personal experiences and personal lives, and whether or not that was in conflict with previous feminisms, which were, as the argument goes, perhaps more staunchly related to policy issues, politics with a big P. So it's very much a discussion about feminism today. Is it unique? Is it divided? And that crucial kind of slogan, the personal is political, in 2019, is that more relevant now than ever? And is it a positive thing for women? Or is there something we need to interrogate in relation to that? I have my own views on feminism. I wrote a book on it called What Women Want, but I'm parking them for this session as chair. And thankfully, I have a brilliant panel to help us kick off this discussion. So I'm going to introduce them very briefly in the order that they're speaking. And if you want to look at their very illustrious biographies that are much longer, please visit the Battle of Ideas website. So first of all, we have Julie Burchill, who is a journalist and author of the novels Ambition and Sugar Rush, a broadcaster and a columnist at the Sunday Telegraph. Next up, we have Rebecca Reed, who is the digital editor of Grazia and the author of Perfect Liars and the Power of Truth. Next up, we have Vicky Price, who is the Chief Economic Advisor and board member of the Centre for Economics and Business Research and the author of Women versus Capitalism. Next, we have Samantha Davies, who is a barrister, a writer, a commentator, and president of the Business and Human Rights Commission. And she wrote an article in relation to the hashtag #MeToo movement, which was brilliant, which is partly why I asked her to come and speak today. And last but not least, Beth Hayden, who is a higher education outreach coordinator and a living freedom organizer. And I've had lots of discussions with her about feminism, and crucially, if you want to find out more about Living Freedom, which is the Battle of Ideas charity's annual residential school for 18 to 25-year-olds, talk to Beth after this session or go and visit the stall at the front of the desk. So how this is going to run is we're going to have introductory speeches from our panel members, and then I'm going to go straight out to you guys for questions and, crucially, comments. Don't feel like you need to be restrained to the idea of questioning. Get up and make your mini speech, but make sure it's mini, otherwise I will cut you off. Right, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Julie.
According to Wikipedia, gross out is a genre of comedy movies aimed at an audience between 18 and 24, in which the makers employ humor which is willfully tasteless or even downright disgusting. It usually involves gratuitous nudity, unrealistic aggressiveness towards property, and Schadenfreude. Since the huge success of Bridesmaids in 2011, some of these films have been made especially for women. I am not narrow-minded, but I am a fan of wit. So show me a gross-out female comedy, and I'm quite likely to projectile vomit. The vulgar saying, better out than in, applies to everything from flatulence to feelings these days, and has become something of a modern mantra. What unites the squelchy slobs and the oversharing snobs is the idea that their inner being is somehow insurrectionary. It's not. The Duchess of Sussex recently ventured the thought that bottling it up causes damage, which makes you wonder in what way she believes her supremely self-contained mother-in-law to be damaged goods. But as talking about feelings has increased, so has self-destructive behavior, especially on the part of young women, for whom self-harm and bulimia may act as a group bonding tool. We have convinced teenage girls that their bodies and emotions are minefields, tiptoeing around their feelings to a ludicrous degree. Think of the recent outcry over the GCSE maths exam using calories as the metric for one of its questions, which eating disorder campaigners claimed was triggering. Treating young women as delicate flowers is a regressive move. Like the self help saying goes, to escape fear, you must go through it, not around it. When called upon to step up, girls can display tremendous toughness. Think of the young Kurdish women who took on ISIS with such glee. What the Grossout comedies and jazz hands at Oxford have in common is favouring of motion over logic, the body over the brain, and the personal over the political. There's a weird emphasis on female trouble throughout society, which, while wearing a caring face, seems to hark back to the times when the hazardous state of female biology rendered them unfit for certain professions. BBC Breakfast is forever moaning on about periods, the menopause, and female incontinence. Men also have embarrassing ailments, but I don't recall being regaled with first hand accounts of impotence or problematic prostates first thing in the morning. Labour has suggested that we have menopause leave so that we delicate little flowers don't have to trouble our heads with big boy stuff like making a living. You could almost believe that women's bodies are public property while men's merit the respect of privacy. When an institution as misogynistic as the BBC makes such a song and dance about the physical glitches of women, I can't help but feel such propaganda may be used to cancel us out somewhere down the line. Or, heaven forbid, pay us less than men because our minds aren't on the job. Women were done out of the best jobs for centuries because of their alleged hormonal instability. Don't think that our rights cannot be rolled back. In the olden days, feminists used to shout loud about equal pay and abortion rights. Now they're squealing about being called names on the internet. I'm dismayed by the modern idea that being a feminist means you have to get your knickers in a twist over dodgy words instead of mocking them as the insults of insecure men who could not get a hand job in Magaluf. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent, said Eleanor Roosevelt, who, were she alive today, would doubtless receive some choice trolling about her looks and her husband's gammy leg, and she would shrug it off with a superior smile. Unlike today's pop and reality starlets, who describe being trolled as torture, which leads them to contemplate suicide, somewhat like a flasher complaining about voyeurs. If people have a healthy level of self-esteem, words really don't hurt, despite the current crybaby climate, which deems misgendering a hate crime. We can shake off sweaty slanders, even find them amusing, because we are adult human females. And the first word of that description means that we should not have hissy fits over any words flung at us. When we put our personal feelings above all else, we end up with a strange and misshapen politics. The chicken licking, parasexual catastrophizing of Extinction Rebellion, and trans rights, which Brendan O'Neill has called misogyny in drag, eroding the rights women have earned through logic and debate. How ironic that the ultimate triumph of feelings that they can cause one to actually transfigure, turning wines into XX chromosome blood, should pose the biggest current threat to women's rights. I'd like to close with a quote from a much better writer than me, James Bloodworth. It may be morally satisfying to parade around in a never kissed a Tory t-shirt, but better perhaps to ask instead why someone is a Tory in the first place. But a pluralistic approach requires confidence in one's own beliefs. After all, to engage with a political opponent on equal terms opens the door to fresh doubts, and doubts lead to heresy. When politics seems to mean so much to some people, leads in turn to a loss of friendships and a collapse in one's identity. The personal is political, and the political is apparently deeply personal.
Thank you. Rebecca, your thoughts?
So, until I was in my late teens, I thought that I was the only woman in the world who'd ever masturbated. because I went to an all-girls school where we talked about everything, like driving lessons and boys and what being slutty meant, but nobody ever sort of admitted that they had had a wank, which left me thinking that I was the only one who'd worked it out, and that I was probably some kind of broken and disgusting addict. I was at Catholic school, which didn't help. So I have a very strong sense that being able to talk openly and honestly about what it is that you're doing, perhaps not, in front of hundreds of thousands of people all the time, but at least amongst people who you have a relationship with, your peer group, your friends in your relationship, seems pretty essential, because otherwise we end up feeling alone. And the fact that women for a really long time have been very ashamed of their bodily functions was super profitable, because if you're worried that your vagina smells bad, then you'll buy stuff to make it smell nice. People still buy terrifying amounts of FemFresh, a completely redundant product that gynecologists will tell you you don't need. Scented tampons, panty liners, so that you can put plastic in the ocean every day. Um, the list of things that you can buy to try and make yourself better and less shamey and less disgusting is very, very long. Much of which I buy into. Eyelash lifts, why not? So obviously I'm not saying that we should be above this, but the worse we feel about our bodies, the more profitable we are, which is why it's sort of very tempting to encourage women to shut the fuck up. And the sort of the depressing flip side of that is that as we've become less shamey and more open to talking about our bodies and our needs and our sexuality, they found new ways to profit off that. So instead of buying things to make you feel bad about yourself, you can now buy a £900 vibrator that's covered in gold. Same principle, people are profiting off you wanting to buy things, but at least this time you get to come. The kind of honest feminism that my generation, I'm 28, in that kind of youngish millennial, missed out on Gen Z area, the kind of honesty that a lot of us are subject to is a very, very beautiful woman on Instagram leaning forward a bit, so she's got one fat roll, and then a 4-page caption about how she's brave for doing this. What I would much rather see is, I look fucking amazing, look at my sick body, I work out 4 days a week, not, guys, I have stretch marks too. And I think that the sort of honesty that we're encouraging women to enjoy does get co-opted and does get made into something kind of with a pretty bow on top of it. And that's annoying, but it doesn't mean that it's not important. The fact that women don't always feel that they can talk about their bodies and their health is genuinely dangerous. A recent study revealed that a lot of women, so STIs are basically sexist. They thrive better in vaginas than they do on penises. And also, a lot of the time, women who are experiencing symptoms of STIs just think, oh, it's probably thrush, or it's probably a UTI, because everything's thrush or a UTI. Whack some Caniston on it, and turns out actually you've been sitting on quite a major infection. This is the kind of thing that if you're talking to your friends about it, somebody might say, oh, actually, itchy, not ideal, see a doctor. These kind of conversations, rather than sort of suppressing them, mean that people might get medical help. And obviously, if you don't get medical help and you've got an STI, you've got the issue of passing it on, but also very often it can cause infertility, which is much, much, much more common in women than it is in men. Similarly, I noticed very strongly, I had a miscarriage earlier this year, and I was genuinely surprised that it hurt. I'd read a lot about people talking about the emotional pain of miscarriages. No one ever told me how incredibly bloody the whole thing is, and how much it hurts, and how awful it is physically. You're effectively going into very, very, very early labour, and no one had ever said that to me. And I started talking a lot about my miscarriage, partially because I'm loudmouthed and that's what I do, and partially because, girls got to pay rent. It was really interesting how people would come to me and be like, you're so brave, I can't believe you're talking about this. And I realised that I'd stumbled on the ultimate sort of personal, political shame fest of vaginas and gynecology and grief. And my God, nobody wants to talk about any of those things. But by talking about it, it's been really helpful for me. Apparently, it's helped other people. And I like to think that if anybody else I know goes through a similar experience, that at least feel they can talk to me. And they might be a bit more forearmed, because I've written a lot about the actual process. And I could find very little about the mechanics of having surgery, gynecological surgery, following a failed pregnancy. So I think that's somewhere that I started to think, actually, do you know what? Maybe I am sick of people sharing stuff on Instagram with hashtags, but come on, it's got to be a good thing that we're talking to each other about these overwhelmingly scary things. There's definitely an inconsistency in the whole sort of general feminist movement, but we're not an organised movement. We don't have an AGM. We don't have a list of bullet points. Maybe we should. But because we're not one singular organised movement, we do have patchy places. So, for instance, on one hand, you've got Free the Nipple, who believe that you should be able to whap your nip out whenever you want to, because a male nipple is no more or less offensive than a female nipple. On the other hand, you've got Ban Page 3, who want women who make a living by getting their boobs out to put tops back on. Either of those things, neither of those things are right or wrong. And similarly, I would say that there's a perception that that feminism intergenerationally is different about gross out, and that my lot are all about talking about your vaginas, and the feminists whose shoulders we stand upon are against that. But I would, in closing, remind you that I believe it was Germaine Greer who suggested we should all try our own menstrual blood. So clearly, the idea of, not a lot of it, just a dab. Not a lot. But so the idea of gross out and being honest has gone back to probably the most famous feminist of all. So I think that it doesn't have to be intergenerational, and it can't be a bad thing for us to be honest.
Thank you, Rebecca. Vicky, your opening thoughts, please.
Thank you. Well, I went to a mixed school, so you can draw your own conclusions. But it was in Greece, and when I woke up every morning, I was thanking God that I was a woman. And the reason for it is that I had a brother who really didn't like very much. But of course, he was a boy, and there was conscription, which there still is in Greece. So he would have to do his military service. So I didn't have to do it. So I thought it was brilliant. So I was prepared to put up with all the stuff that we have to go through because I didn't have to do this silly conscription. However, you probably have been reading about Sajid Javid, who I'll bring into this conversation, the Chancellor, who was just last week encouraged by the defense minister to spend more money on defense and bring it up to the sort of 2% that we're supposed to have under NATO. And various countries were referred to which actually achieve it, including Greece. Sajid Javid's response was, we must really look at Greece as an example because they spend all this money on conscripts and they spend all the time, those conscripts, drinking ouzo. So if I had realized that that was what was going on, and that's what the men did when they went on their various ships and so on to be conscripts for Greece, then I might have changed my mind. But then I came to England, and of course there's no conscription. So you then think, well, what's the benefit of being a woman, particularly? And of course you immediately then hit the inequality issues. And I've been hearing quite a lot about feminism and so on. I've written various books on this. My main belief is that we can achieve what we want to achieve as women, and of course better also the lot of men by achieving economic empowerment. I think feminism should focus on that rather than anything else. I mean, they can do whatever they like, but as well at the same time. But if you don't have economic empowerment, you can do all these other things, but you will always have the balance of power against you. And it's really interesting how you can demonstrate that. And it's quite powerful, of course, to have the types of movements that make the point, like Me Too again. And if I can stick to the Greek examples, just a couple of days ago, there was this big celebration, which we always have in Greece, of having said no to the Italians and then defeating them before the Germans came in at the beginning of the Second World War. And Greece was shocked by the fact that these things happen with schools, sort of the best students, sort of holding the flag and walking down the street in all sorts of boroughs of Athens and everywhere else. But this time, a bunch of schoolgirls decided to get dressed in sort of black trousers and white shirts. And what they did in front of the assembled masses, including the archbishop, the head of their city, the mayor, and so on, was they just decided to parade and completely and utterly ridicule this militarism. And they danced, or rather they walked like John Cleese, doing the Ministry of Silly Walks walk. It is an amazing video to watch. They didn't do it very well. They did practice. They didn't do it, but the message that they gave was so strong, and the young loved it. I think this is a really important intergenerational issue that matters hugely. And they made fun of this. It's about time that type of sort of show of might perhaps can change. So my view on economic empowerment then is that where the manifestation is that we don't have it is in the pay gap. We have a misallocation of resources. Women, obviously, despite all the problems they have, menstruation and everything else, manage by the time they finish university to do better than the boys. So we obviously have something there that we can use, and yet we actually suffer this big gap that's still there. And it isn't just in terms of doing things and getting paid a lot less for the same amount of work. It is also not having the senior positions and not having role models that one can look at. And of course, the pay gap then is enormous, and the power balance remains pretty poor. So, for example, EasyJet and Ryanair, men make up some 89% and 97% of top earners, respectively. Well, of course, that means because they haven't got any pilots. I was doing a feminism debate, would you believe it, in Durham University, and one of the students got up and said, but surely, if we're going to be having more EasyJet pilots who are women, we'll have to lower our safety standards. And the extraordinary thing is that the women in the room didn't lynch this person. They just accepted it, which seems to me quite extraordinary. Well, my view is that it's not happening fast enough, and it isn't going to happen fast enough if we leave it as it is. So I believe in huge government intervention to do it, and I think all our movements can achieve some of that, because we cannot leave it to the market. So my view is that we need a sort of a capitalist system which has huge encouragement from the government. And I just want to finish by reading out what I found in the Evening Standard yesterday. Alison Rose, who was the head of commercial banking in the Royal Bank of Scotland, which is where I started my career in the UK, had done a big review about finance for women and discovered that actually women were finding it very, very difficult to get finance. There's bias and so on, and produced a very good report. The result of that is that, perhaps not directly, she's now the first female head of a sort of proper retail bank. Santander, of course, has somebody from Spain, but here in the UK. And she has just been named that and just started on the 1st of November. And she's issued this statement to her people. She said, at the heart of how I will run the bank is my conviction that if our customers do well, if our economy does well, and if our communities do well, then we all succeed together. So I'm pledged to build a bank that is more open, more accessible, and more inclusive. And I thought, inclusive, excellent. She's written a whole report on this. At the same time, she announced her new executive committee and the restructuring. So her executive committee will have Paul Thwaite as CEO for commercial banking and Peter Flavel as the CEO of private banking. Ollie Holborn adds purpose, sustainability, and ventures to his responsibilities as Director of Strategy. Rob Whittick is appointed Director of the Office of the Chief Executive. I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you. Samantha, your thoughts?
Thank you. Thank you, Vicky, for that. Illuminating and very relevant, some of the points I want to make. I'll just start by saying I've never described myself as a feminist, ever, actually. Even though I think other people describe me as such, perhaps from when I was about 7 or 8 years old, mainly because I've never seen why I should be treated differently on account of being female. What I believe in is freedom, and freedom for everyone. And so that brings me to, in some ways, some of the problems or issues I've had with feminism as a movement, and with feminism in terms of how it tries to define and delineate its objectives, and also what I remember particularly in my university years, who was considered worthy of being a feminist, you know, who could buy into and co-opt and adopt those feminist canons, and who couldn't. So I think, you know, feminism as a movement has its issues, and one of those is the intersectionality, a word which we are getting acquainted with and using for the first time, and very pertinently and relevant to that, the inclusion and sort of respect, I would say, for women of color within that movement. So that's my opening gambit, and I'd say, so there's a lot that feminism needs to do to make itself more inclusive and therefore a more effective movement. In terms of gross out, I think, Julia, I understand what you say about potentially projectile vomiting at having to see any of this stuff being performed or done. But it's actually really important because of the point Vicky just made. You read out the board of a bank which is being led by a woman, but her entire team is made up of men. Why is that? Well, I say gross out feminism and some of these performative acts are actually very relevant to the makeup of that board, because these spaces tend to be or tend to feel unwelcome to women even in relation to their bodily functions. I can tell you that I know about and have very direct evidence of people being in buildings, being at work, and being in situations where it was not comfortable for them to just be a woman physically. And that's not acceptable. If your office doesn't have toilets that make provision for things you need, how can you have a comfortable day at work? So I think there is a need to talk about these things. I think there is benefit in talking about the gross stuff. There is benefit in talking about our bodies. Why should we be embarrassed about it? It's absolutely essential. It's actually why we're all here and how we're all here. So why are we embarrassed about it? Why can't we say how it works? Why can't children grow up knowing about this as normal? Why should girls be embarrassed? And why do sometimes young men who aren't acquainted with these things feel embarrassed themselves and not even know how they ought to react? I think there has been benefit in talking about these matters in the recent years, actually. There's been physical, very clear demonstrations of that. My profession is the bar, and I can see how just having greater dialogue about feminism and being a woman, and actually having a right to be physically present in certain spaces, has a knock-on effect on actual tangible changes of people then having a voice in relation to policy. So I think there is a place for gross out feminism. There is a place for Me Too. The Me Too movement has had a really massive impact, again, in the legal sector, where women have for the first time been able to talk about how they are treated as minorities within, and minorities, again, a really loaded term, because it's a label. It's not actually a fact. A lot of law firms now can tell you and attest to the fact that the vast majority of their intake at the junior level are female. Yet the females still feel like a minority. Why is that, and why should they? I think the Me Too movement has helped to turn that on its head, because what it's done is given women a right to be present. It's given women a right to talk about the things that bother them. It's given women a right to talk about sexual harassment, which, by the way, is very common and quite prevalent. It's also forced these organizations to take action and build processes and mechanisms to eliminate some of these problems. I think gross out feminism, whether we're talking about our nipples, and first of all, I don't see why women should ever be embarrassed about breastfeeding in public or anywhere else for that matter. I think these issues, whether we like them or not, whether we consider it to be a simplistic or a potentially overly performative demonstration of some sort of aspect of feminism, they have a place. They have a place because what they do, in my view, is allow women to physically take up space. And when we physically take up space, when we physically occupy space, when I physically am present here as a Black female, I think what you then have an opportunity to do is influence the dialogue. And if we don't influence dialogue, we don't move forward, we don't create freedom for all.
Beth, your opening thoughts, please.
Yeah, thanks for that, Samantha. I do agree. I think Me Too has given women a right to be present, but I think it's continued to just engender women as victims and continue that narrative. But anyway, right. While a source of entertainment, gross out feminism has taken personal politics to ridiculous realms which confuse and belittle the political cause of feminism today. Tweeting President Trump about your period is not activism. Announcing that women fart during sex is not a hallmark for feminism. And comparing the smell of your vagina to chicken ramen, as Amy Schumer has done, is not a powerful political statement. It's just gross. Yet women all over are picking up the personal baton and one-upping each other with outrageous statements, claiming it to be in the name of feminism and power. Hashtags are flying all over Twitter and Instagram, such as saggy boobs matter, girls wank too, and pretty period. Where has it come from? It is, quite simply, the exaggeration and misinterpretation of a phrase in second wave feminism that was meant to make women aware of how some aspects of their body, like abortion rights and period poverty, are still ruled by political forces. It was not a prescription as to how to live one's life. To say that my personal being is dictated by politics is to infer that I don't have control over my life, my choices, or my body. It's patronizing, and it needs to stop. Looking inwards to find a political direction for feminism puts it in a straitjacket, reduces women to biological creatures, and simplifies a political movement for change. I'm not saying that equality has been achieved, but we've got it better than ever right now. We have laws designed to protect us from rape, sexual harassment, gender discrimination, wage disparity, domestic violence, and other atrocities that many women around the world face daily. The problem is that now, feminists are trying to navigate a space less clear-cut in law. They're attempting to change the subversive plane of unconscious biases and personal stigmas, while there are still political matters to address. And all it's done is snowball into fat shaming and the celebration of body hair. Why aren't sex slavery, FGM, or abortion rights taking the spotlight? Why are we furthering the divide between men and women by highlighting our biological differences? And why has my sex life become a political matter? And don't get me started on the privilege of this all. When Kiran Gandhi decided to run the London Marathon on her period with no pad or tampon, did she not give thought to the women who don't have the privilege to make such a choice and instead have no option but to go commando anyway? Instead, she was challenging the way society was supposedly taught women to feel about their period. For me, a pad, tampon, moon cup, whatever it is a welcome friend. So thank you, society, for that. I'd really like to know the extent to which some women consider the impression of the patriarchy when they decide to tell the world about their unkempt nethers or trapped gas. Maybe they just think it's a sign of a good feminist. Or maybe feminism has become, after all its legal and political achievements, a fight against manspreading, microaggressions, and other cultural norms. Or perhaps this is a response to the reductive sexism seen in lads' mags, porn, and plastic surgery, which commodified sex and gave rise to the self-loathing girl. I agree, body image and women's portrayal in the media should not be ignored. It's easy to agree with equal pay for equal work. It is perhaps more difficult to open up to those troubling truths about our personal lives and accept that our actions might have a political grounding. But please just don't shove it down my throat with pussy hats and hashtags, nor interfere in matters which are private and unique to me. Instead, couple this simplistic patriarchy versus women fight with a fight for continued economic and legal equality. Look outwards as well as in, and don't lose sight of the broader political picture among the body hair you are so freely growing.
Right, we've got a lot of room for questions and comments on that. And I just want to challenge one thing that I wanted to perhaps address in this opening discussion is the difference between talking about things and then politically acting on them. So let's figure out things about, you know, menopause leave or quotas or things like that that are actually turning a genuine discussion into policy action. That might be an interesting way to go. Let's see some hands. I'm going to take a number and then I'm going to come back to the panel for thoughts.
So I'd just like to start by addressing Julie's point. I found that a lot of what you said was very interesting, but I think what I'd like to go back to was a lot of the things that you were describing, such as women becoming crybabies nowadays and getting offended over the smallest thing, was a bit strange, mainly because the characteristics that you were describing were ones that are often inherently seen as masculine characteristics. And my main point that I just wanted to address is that feminism, what it comes down to is that we should have the right to make a choice about everything. It is our choice to dictate how we live our lives, what we say, what we do, how we dress, what we talk about. It is all our choice. And so if we decide that we want to be sensitive, we want to have emotions, and we want to express them, if we decide that we want to be tough and angry and to just laugh things off, then either of those things should be fine. But women should not be ashamed to feel emotions and to cry and to feel bad about things, because we're human beings. And I think just in general, this whole thing about grossed out feminism, we should have the choice to decide how we talk about our bodies and who we force them.
Thank you very much.
I think there's a difference between privacy and shame. I would just say, don't assume that because someone doesn't talk about their periods all the time, they are suppressing it, or they are ashamed of it, or even embarrassed, or that they don't think they have a right to talk about it. It's just a private thing, and privacy is okay. And B, I actually think that it's quite boring. The fact that I'm a woman is the least interesting thing about me, and I'm not even a very interesting person. So
I'm sure that's not
true. My bodily functions are even less interesting than that.
I think it's worth thinking through some of the consequences of bringing the private and the intimate into the public, perhaps even at work, and that is you open yourselves up for further regulation of things that aren't actually anything to do with your performance at work or your being a public person. It's your private self. And so some of the most intimate things are open further to regulation. So that would be one of my concerns. I think this is something else that's quite interesting, that as the personal has become more political, the political has become more personal. And in fact, in some ways, the political is entirely off limits. I'm just thinking of something like Extinction Rebellion. One of their campaign slogans is that this is too important for politics. And so you get now really the most kind of frenetic and frenzied discussion about the tiniest details of people's lives, and some of the big issues are considered entirely apolitical and off the agenda, which is the flip side of this discussion.
So the topic is about gross out feminism. Who do you think gets grossed out by these things the most, men or women? And whose fault is it that we get grossed out by certain things more than others? Is it men or women? Or was it the patriarchy that made us all think that things should be gross that were never gross or were gross? I don't know. What do you think?
Hi, I think my problem with feminism is what you spoke about, Vicky, is that I think that if feminism is supposed to be about equality, why is it that women are held essentially to a higher standard? And while I think it is hypocritical for that new head of a bank to turn around and say we're about inclusion and have an all-male committee, why is it so wrong for her to be a woman and to do that? If feminism is about equality, then there should be no difference between her and a man who does that, and we should view them both as bad because they're not inclusive, rather than her as worse because she isn't inclusive.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask the panel whether there's any other gains of civilization that you'd like to roll back. I mean, should we start sneezing on our sleeves, farting anywhere we like? Should men just kind of walk around, slocking out their dicks whenever they want to? That's just their body, that's the truth, and they should occupy the space like the women should. I mean, why? What a strange terrain to try to move society forwards, to try to undo actually civilized behaviour, which is about pushing backwards the things which really make us animal rather than human, so that we can create the space to be humans in our interactions with each other.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's come back to the panel. Let's go along the table this way. Start with you, Julie. Any just short comments on anything there? Don't feel the need to answer everything. So any comments?
Yeah, the young lady who said she's got a right to be sensitive. Of course, no one's going to stop you being like that. But that is a really stereotypical female way to be. It's nothing revolutionary about crying easily. And the more, do you want to do that on the internet where you're giving people exactly the reaction they want? It seems to me of course, cry in private, but if you're going to cry on the internet, you're going to satisfy every sadist in the world. And I don't think that's a good thing.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca, anything you want to comment on?
I think it was an interesting thing that you think it's uncivilized to talk about your abortion or your miscarriage. It's not uncivilized, it's sort of essential. And if you don't talk about those things, particularly those things that are unique to women, then all the research would suggest that it drives you absolutely bloody bonkers. I think civilized society is where you can talk about the things that are paining you and frightening you and changing you as a person. And I don't think that me talking to my friends about my abortion is the same as a man slopping his dick out.
Yeah.
Okay, Samantha. Oh, you're very polite with the clapping, but it does take up time. So hold on, sit on your hands for a while. Okay?
Yeah. A number of things I would like to come back on, but I will try to restrict it to 2 or so, or 3. The question about the head of the bank, was it RBS, Vicky, who has an all-male team? No one is holding her up to a higher standard and saying, as a woman, she must employ women. No, not at all. She did that. She set out her stall and said that she was going to be more inclusive and has failed to demonstrate how she's lived up to that at all in the board that she's appointed. So I understand the point you're making. Of women have to, sometimes having to tick every box, be kind and compassionate, but also know how to, be strong and firm and everything else that comes with, being successful in the professional sphere. But in this specific case, I don't think that's what we're saying at all, and I don't think that's what the issue is. So if a male head of the bank had come out and said he intended to be inclusive and named that board, it would be just as laughable. On grossing out and who decided whether or not we should be grossed out, I would just blame the patriarchy. So leave it at that.
I just want to push. Can you expand on that? Because I think it'd be useful for the discussion. Define the patriarchy.
Oh wow. Oh god.
It's tough, but I think
that is really tough. Well, we're defining, when I say the patriarchy, I'm referring to the social structures that have defined society. Well, since I don't want to say since the beginning of time, but let's sort of take it from the 18th and 19th century, at least. Let's start then. And where, which set out the place for women, which set out the roles for men, which set out the roles for people of different colors, which set out the roles for people of different religions. That time when we tried to sort of stratify and create a sort of a vertical structure to society, I think that's where this question of what is acceptable, what we deem civilized, or not, as the case may be, that's, I think, where those things began, and that's what I'm defining as the patriarchy.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and on that point, I'd say, also whether or not we want to accept it or not, we're human, but we're also animal. So we need to take those 2 things into account.
Okay, Beth, any comments?
Yes, agreed. Yeah, I really resonated with what was said up there about, privacy is okay. I think, I ended by saying, stop shoving it down my throat. I completely agree with that. I don't need to see it all the time, because having a period and functioning biologically as a woman is not an achievement. Get over it. Everybody has that. So why can't we talk about something else? Yeah, I agree. It's kind of boring, isn't it? So why can't I talk about not just my identity as having a vagina? Why can't I talk about, achievements I've made in my life that doesn't, reduce me to a biological being? So, yeah.
Vicky?
Well, right, on the equality issue, I think there are loads and loads of obstacles for women. And I think actually, perhaps the lady who said that the fact that she's a woman is the least interesting thing about her, I wouldn't agree with that, because as a woman, you have to have all these, face all these extra challenges, I'm afraid, whether we like it or not. And women face them continuously through their work. They have loads and loads of restrictions in what they do. and you shake your head, but of course you weren't born in Ethiopia or anywhere like that, or in India and elsewhere, where there are serious restrictions in terms of having legal rights, being able to have a bank account. Even in Switzerland, women until 1965 were not allowed to work without the permission of their husbands. They still haven't achieved equal pay. So there are loads and loads of inhibitions. And if you look also at the growth of economies, since you talked about patriarchy and going back, between 1500 and 1850, primarily, which I have looked at because there have been lots of studies on what actually allowed some countries to grow. The really interesting thing was the raising of the marriageable age made a huge difference to the countries over a period of time that grew and developed, and the ones that were left behind. So because the women were more involved in A, education, B, work, and so on. And going back then to the issue of the lady who now runs RBS, I wasn't necessarily accusing her, but of course you can talk about wanting to have inclusivity, and then you look around you, of course, and because of the restrictions that are already there, the women aren't there. So I'm just hoping that there will be a change in terms of this lady's executive committee. But there have been so many barriers. Women have just dropped out of the race. So your choice is much less. Competition for those jobs is much less. It just stays within a certain circle, and we all suffer in terms of growth and so on. And also, you don't have the woman there with all the issues that we've just been discussing, changing the culture of the organization to one that is more embracing of what women need and what they require in order to do a day's job properly, and all the other issues they may have with children and everything else, which the men at present don't seem to spend as much time doing.
Okay, thank you. Let's come back out for questions. And I'm just going to press some issues. So one thing I definitely do want to talk about is the difference between, it's important to clarify that gross out feminism is a specifically Western concept. So this is something that happens within Western feminism. But is there a difference between abortion rights, for example, and talking about body hair, one of which is a legal matter or a matter of autonomy, one of which could be described as being just personal, or are the two combining? Can we differentiate those things? Let's see some hands.
Yeah, in a way, I'm sort of disturbed by the comment that we get reduced to biological identity. I actually think biological identity is supremely important. And I think that celebrating our biologies, whether we're men or women, is necessary. It's part of our history. It's how we developed. It's how our roles came into play. So much of who we are as human beings is connected to our biology. So, and this goes to the comment about we're animals. Yes, we are. And so I think that it's really important that we don't just sort of bring out these things, our vaginas, our capacity to give birth, our menstrual cycles, and men with all their stuff from a gross perspective, but as a celebratory perspective. I mean, women rock.
I have a question for Samantha. You said in your opening remarks that women feel uncomfortable in offices just being themselves. I genuinely can't think what you mean. I've never been to an office that didn't have like adequate toilet facilities for women.
That's you.
I mean, if we're talking,
Hang on, let me speak.
I'm sure it's illegal. You have to have
Hold the
sorry,
microphone.
sorry. I'm sure there are laws around these things. You have to have, toilets that females can access in every public space. But I could be wrong. I mean, what we're talking about here, tampon dispensers. Like, how many concessions do you want employers to make? Why can't women just remember to bring a tampon? Like, I mean, an example that sort of is kind of similar to that, I suppose. I'm a contact lens wearer, and my eyes get very dry staring at a screen and with the air conditioning in the office. Should I expect my employer to have eye drop dispensers, or should I take responsibility and remember to bring eye drops with me in the same way that I remember to bring tampons with me?
Okay, thank you.
Can I respond?
At the back.
Can I-
I don't mean to kind of throw a bomb into the debate, but Always have recently removed the female symbol in their products and are discussing people with periods and menstruators. So what role does that play if women are now erased from their biology?
Okay, thank you.
We've had a lot of talk about women's bodies and periods and vaginas and stuff like that,
And we are allowed to talk about that because we're from a place of privilege. We live in the UK, we've had the Equal Pay Act. Do you think that this debate in itself, like, do you think it even represents feminism? Because for me, feminism is about sisterhood. It's about us women coming together for equality. And that's not just equality in the UK. It has been briefly mentioned about living in Ethiopia or India, but I think there needs to be so much more emphasis on the FGM, on forced marriages. Like, the living standards for women globally are not on the level that they are with us. So how can we sit here and argue about body autonomy for women when there are women who are literally being killed for being women? Literally, how can we focus on something so small when there's so much larger debate?
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask about the definition of the patriarchy that was given. You talked about oppressive structures, but often, could you elaborate on that? Because oftentimes people use the sort of buzzwords of institutional, systematic, structural oppression, but they very rarely or seldom elaborate on that, of what those structures are, what those systems are, those institutions. Because if we know what they are, we can fight them.
Just to say something that brings together abortion and the personal and the political. And I run British Pregnancy Advisory Service, which provides 75,000 abortions to women in Britain a year. I'll probably spend more time talking about abortion than most people do. And the point that I want to make is that talking about abortion can happen in one of two ways. You can either talk about how it feels for you with your mates and over a glass of wine and so on, and that's absolutely fine. And you'll get a load off your chest by doing it, and it's great to be out there and have that experience of solidarity. It does absolutely nothing to change things politically. What changes things politically is not when you're talking about your own experience, your personal life. What matters politically is when you look at the problems that stop people from getting the abortion that they need, and you turn the experiences that you have into a way of doing an activity. So it's like when you're looking and learning about the fact that one of the really important things about abortion at the moment is the fact that the government's looking to maybe pull down the time limit. So you're using your experience to explain why it is women really need abortions and why the law shouldn't change. Or you're using your experience to say it's really important that that abortion isn't just limited to particular kinds of clinics and women should be able to take pills to take at home. My point is that talking about things personally is a personal thing. Talking about things and using it politically can really make a difference. I think it's all about what we do. I'd just like to say finally, I thought Julie's comment when she said that no one can make you feel inferior without your consent is a real take-home point from this. Because again, it's not just about our feelings, it's what we do that really counts.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi there. I was wondering if it even needed to be pitched as an either-or debate. I have male friends who, maybe it says more about the company I keep, but male friends who talk about their dicks a lot and are able to negotiate social commentary, and I have female friends who can talk about their vaginas and still negotiate political commentary. It doesn't seem that to be able to talk about your vagina means that you cannot change the world, you cannot enact on the different things you feel about, think about. It's just about opening up the conversation. I think recently about the period poverty campaign seems to have come about the ability within society to be able to talk about periods more often, and for people to be able to have conversations with their friends about what it really means to have a period when you can't afford to buy a tampon or go to school. And you can't really expect the RBS boardroom to level itself out if girls can't go to school because they can't afford tampons.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I have to say that it can be your choice not to talk about your period. You can count it as a private thing, but I do believe it's not private, and the women, they have to talk about it. How can it be private when it affect my life? How about that in the university, for example, when I'm pale, my tutor come to me and say that you seem pale, but I should say that, oh, I have headache. So I deny to say that I'm on my period. So you talk about that there are more important issues than being on your period. But me, as a woman who comes from a conservative country, when earthquake happen, so preparing pads for women counts as a luxury thing. Why? Because they don't talk about it. So how about those women that, a lot of women actually, that they have endometriosis and they actually, I see them that sometimes they have to sleep with diapers, so they are suffering by bleeding. So there are a lot of issues, and we shouldn't just really think that because I am not suffering from the heavy period, so the other, they don't suffer either.
Thank you. So the microphone comes.
I realise I'm getting old, and bits of me aren't working quite as well as they used to. And I'm not going to talk about that. However,
you can.
It reminds me that when they were working, I was in my 20s, and it was the 90s. And in the 90s, there was this thing called the ladette, which was, or who was, a young, working class, assertive, confident individual. A phenomenon which many feminists, many liberal feminists, castigated as being an invention of the media, sexist invention of the media. But I remember social life and cultural life of my generation, that could be quite an authentic representation of a particular attitude, confident, assertive, and taking the liberty you got when it came to partying and drinking and fucking, as well as the men, right? But what's interesting is that and the backlash against that assertive working class feminist identity, position, culture, cultural moment, in fact, came from liberal feminists who seem to very much dislike this very class-based declaration of confidence and self-assertion. And it's interesting that in the 20 years, 30 years in between, I noticed that young people in general have become much more cultivated when it comes to expressing their emotions, and a culture that cultivates their attention to themselves as little inner beings, often quite fragile beings, is not something limited to women. It is part of a more general youth culture that doesn't want to affect change, but simply wants to express itself. And that is apparent amongst young women as it is apparent amongst young men. I think we do need to look at it generationally and in terms of that culture of how we assert ourselves as individuals, how we take on things to be who we are.
Thank you. Okay, I'll come back to the panel. I'll come this way through. Just pick up on a few points. Vicky, if you want to start off with any comments you have from those.
Well, I mean, this year, what happens in other parts of the world is absolutely relevant, and I already touched on this. And you're quite right. I mean, the stories you read about suppression of women in various places is extraordinary. And then you see various protests about various things here, and you think how insignificant they are by comparison. But of course, by just bringing those issues up, I think that I agree with a point made there, that you've got to talk about them in a way. And if you are to change the lot of women elsewhere, and also the ones here, frankly, because women are the ones, remember, who are most likely to fall into poverty because of this inequality that we have right now in our system, then you need to be involved and be involved in politics. So the personal can become, which I think is what your question was earlier. So I think we need to do that, and we have a duty to do it. And I think that's now what all the other movements do. If they should really be embraced in the sense that they contribute to that politicizing of it, if you like, and making it more public. But I agree with an earlier comment which said that we don't actually have all these movements together in a way that can have a coherent whole. And I think as a result, we're missing out in terms of having the type of influence. And we're bitty in terms of particular issues, but we don't actually look at improving the lot of women as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Beth, anything to pick up on?
Yeah, actually, firstly, with what you were talking about with abortion rights and body hair and where the distinctions are between them, I think there are definitely distinctions between them. You know, abortion rights and that, you know, legislation is still in the hands of sort of male-dominated halls in Westminster, whereas body hair is not a political matter. So people are confusing those together. I think I agree. We need to look at it generationally. And I think, you know, specifically to feminism and women, we need to be listening. Younger women like myself, I'm 23. You know, I was raised in a house with two very strong women, and I listened to them. And I think that's a call for younger feminists to really listen to older generations. It's not time for them to step aside. It's time for you to learn about the actual struggles that they had to get the rights that we enjoy now, and stop thinking that everything's, so ghastly now. We do have it better than ever in this society, in this culture, at least. And if you wanted to consider other parts of the world where these atrocities are happening, then why not let's gear this movement towards thinking about that and trying to target that, rather than focusing inwards on the inner self, the fragile self, and the personal, and make that political.
Okay, thank you. Samantha, anything you want to pick up on?
Yeah, a couple of things. So the point made about women needing to take control and make provision for themselves, and this being sort of equated to needing contact lenses, it's really not that at all. The examples that I was given were very specific and potentially very personal to certain people. And I think the question you asked makes an assumption of a baseline that didn't even exist. So your question suggests, so are you saying employers should provide women with, things they need, tampons? No, not at all. What this woman was saying, actually at the very basic level, she just needed a bin, and it didn't exist. And that I think the question sort of assumes, and this is one of the problems with some of the conversation we have, we make assumptions when women raise issues that this person is just being fragile, being delicate, and being a snowflake. And it really hampers the debate, and it really hampers our collective growth. The next point that I wanted to come back on was the very important point the lady made about this being a global movement. And I really agree with you. And that's why I started off by saying that I have issues with feminism myself as a defined term. I've never described myself as such, and that what I believe in is freedom for everyone. And when I say it's important for different people to have a seat at the table, it's for that specific reason, to fight for and to try and engender freedom for everyone beyond our borders, because when we do that, we actually make the world a better place for ourselves.
Okay, thanks. Rebecca?
Oh, so many. Okay, quickly. Number one, ladette point. I think what I would say is that, so I was born in the 90s, so I don't remember the raising of it, but I do remember in the 2000s, there was a show called Ladette to Lady, where they tried to teach ladettes to be ladies. Cracking rewatch if anyone's interested. But I think the issue with the word ladette wasn't that people didn't like the idea of a working class woman taking control of her own life, drinking a pint and then giving a blowjob. The issue was that it was people seemed unable to hold two things in their head, that you could drink the pint, give the blowjob, and be a CEO. And I think that was the things that the ladette defined you as one static thing, not a whole rainbow of things, which we all are. Other points, the grenade, the trans rights, biology, women, clusterfuck is so complicated. I'm not going to go into it because I'm frightened of saying the wrong thing. And also, I don't necessarily want to derail the conversation. But what I would say is that all of the hardest things that have happened to me in my life have been because I have a uterus. So when I talk about feminism, I talk about being a woman, I talk about my uterus. And other people don't have to have one or can have one, whatever you want. Define yourself however you want, but don't tell me I can't talk about my uterus as a woman. And then the sort of final thing that I wanted to say is that I think there's a lot of conversation about how we're talking about Western feminism and we're all such babies and it's much harder if you live in a war zone. True, but I'm a selfish person. I'm out for myself and I am interested in the things that affect me as well as the things that affect the entire world. I can care about more than like 3 or 4 things in one go. And I care particularly, I took my friend to an abortion, I had to put my coat over her head and push somebody out the way because they won't put a bloody exclusion zone a metre round where she was going into. That happened in London, in Essex, and that happened here. And I care about that as well as everything that's happening all over the world. Sorry, that was a lot.
No, that's fine. I'm going to push you guys individually, but the one thing I wanted to raise from the questions in the audience towards you, Rebecca, and perhaps towards the whole panel is, because I think we're getting stuck in maybe talking about the goodness of talking about things, which I think no one, as of yet, surprise me if you want, has argued for censorship of certain subjects. But what overall political effect does it have if the discussion about women's rights is centered around, gross out is kind of a side issue, was a quirk that I picked up out of a few articles. But if the central things we talk about are period poverty or body issues or things like that, does that frame women politically in a different way to men. I think that's maybe what Julie was getting at. Is that problematic, or do you think that's
I'm willing to accept. I'm willing to accept that women need slightly different things from men. I don't know whether that's horribly unfashionable, but I'm going to probably give birth at some point, and my husband almost certainly isn't. And then I'm going to lactate, and again, he's almost certainly not going to lactate. And there's not going to be anywhere for me to breath. If I want to go back to work, I'm going to have to pump, which makes you into effectively a cow, or sit in a loo pumping all day, not being in a meeting. And that stuff. And when I had my miscarriage, I wasn't entitled to any leave. I could get signed off by my doctor if my doctor was nice about it. Or my doctor could have said, go back to work, you're fine. That stuff only happens to women. And I don't want to be treated like a baby or a delicate little flower, but I do want to be treated like somebody who's probably going to give birth and lactate and maybe lose a pregnancy and bleed and all that stuff, because I'm the only one, no, I'm not the only one who's doing it. Some of you are also, but I'm one of the 51% who are doing it. So maybe I do need a bit of a special treatment.
Okay, right. Julie, anything you want to pick up on?
Oh, yeah. I once wrote, it was quite a good line. Men are the sum of their parts. Women are some of their parts. And I do think...
That is good.
Thank you. I do think that too much concentration on bodily functions, sensitivity, it's not anything new. It's what women have always been marginalized and told they couldn't be airline pilots because of these things. If we cling too much to our wombs, they will turn around and bite us one day.
Okay, right. Let's go back out to you guys.
Yeah, so what I'm missing in this whole debate, and I think in pretty much all debates I'm in about feminism and what goes in that direction, is a look at a greater picture. Where do you not just at what's wrong right now? How is it okay to do this or to have less women in certain positions of power? But a greater picture, how do you want the world to look like when you have kind of achieved it? And another thing that I just wanted to address real quick is special treatment for women. And you would like some special treatment, Rebecca.
Who wouldn't?
I think it would be better if that would just be normal treatment. If you would just be treated normally, not specially as a woman because you're special, because you're what's unique to your, kind of human, or being female, but as being normal, as being a human among others, and not a special kind of human.
Recently, this debate around, the hashtag I'm not like other girls and like N-logs and stuff like that, and a lot of these things about agency, about people telling other people they have internalized misogyny, a lot of those things come in under that, and that's a lot about youth culture and the way that young people are expressing themselves. And I kind of think in the middle of all of that is the idea that a woman should have the agency to decide who she is, but can be affected by the way that other women lead their lives online and politically. So I kind of see where that's coming from. I think you raised, sorry, I don't remember your name, just looking on there. Yeah, just over there. A really interesting point that a lot of the gross out is about privilege and obviously assumes a lot of things that, everyone in this country can get access to period care and everyone in this country can do certain things, and a lot of it is about flaunting privilege in a certain way. But I also think it is important. And I had an abortion just before I did my A-levels, and I was very young, and I kind of on that point about having abortions, it's really difficult to kind of get any kind of information about what that's going to be like. And my doctor was pushing me to wait and then have a surgical abortion, and because nobody tells you and nobody really writes about the fact that having an induced miscarriage is incredibly painful. And I think that's something that people didn't bring up and I think is really important. So I can kind of see where everyone's coming from, but I think there needs to be enough nuance to encapsulate lives of various people. Western feminism isn't white feminism, they're not the same thing. Kind of tying into the normal comment, something someone said ages ago about if we're talking about these things, isn't it highlighting more the differences between women and men and making us even more different? I had a similar experience to Rebecca in that this was not something that we ever talked about at school. I did go to a mixed school. Sex education was very much, here's how boys' bodies work. And there was no, here's how women's bodies work, except for the one time we were taken away for a special periods talk that the boys weren't allowed to come to. And I just feel like I have thought this issue could be sorted out by better sex education for years, because if it was something that was talked about when we are younger, as though this is normal things for girls and this is normal things for boys, then we are all just normal, and it normalizes sorry, voice getting nerves. It normalizes the body functions and actually takes it away as an issue rather than creating it as a new issue.
Okay.
So if I'm lucky enough to have a daughter, and I hope I do one day, if she's crazy enough to want to work 60 hours a week in a boardroom, to want that job, I want her to get that job because she's bloody brilliant, not because there's some drive to get more women on boardrooms. Is that not the goal, that you want to be viewed for your own merits, not because you're a woman? It's a weird... And just finally, if I could really quickly...
Can the other microphone come over here, please?
To talk about patriarchy. Is that the patriarchy, these structural civilizations that were built on the backs of men and boys sent to die in war?
I think this whole argument is quite patronising, implying that it's sort of the man behind you said, in the sense of, I as a person want to be judged on my mind, not my uterus or my boobs or this or that. And so why it sort of links to what Samantha said earlier, why do women have a right to be in these boardrooms if they're not the best for the job? And why what is the direct link between talking about periods and getting on into boardrooms? What is the link between them?
Hi, I really take the point about not wanting to reduce women to biology, but at the same time, I think the gross out feminism as such is a kind of reaction to the fact that women were not allowed to talk about biology for a really long time. And, there's been a lot of medical research about things like male impotence and male sexual dysfunction. And there's far less research in terms of female sexual dysfunction and, girls who leave school and don't know what their clitoris is and, anatomically incorrect diagrams in GCSE textbooks, being updated. So whilst some people feel that, showing vulvas and all that kind of thing on, jewelry, is kind of part of gross out feminism. At the same time, we've only just started to talk about female anatomy and how it functions, and there's still an alarming number of men who think that women urinate through their vaginas, for example. And I think, we kind of, even though we do need to address those things. So I think that talking about female anatomy and how we function is really important.
I was at school in the 60s and 70s, and you wouldn't, to talk about periods and stuff like that, you wouldn't say anything. But my son's 26, and we had a conversation not that long ago, and he said, I said something about one of his friends, and he said, oh, she wasn't feeling very well, she had she was having a period. And that was said in a very normal way, maybe just because I've really brought him up really well, but and I was struck by, the change. And I think if a change like that happens easily and naturally, because we are talking about it, and maybe we talk about things like this in a little bit of a crass way at first. So I think it is changing, and I think it's fine. It's absolutely fine. And one of the things that, for me, that I slightly struggle with is that nobody in my life ever told me I couldn't be a doctor or I couldn't be successful because I was a woman. And I went to, I went to school in the 70s, the 60s and 70s. And I sort of hear people say things like women, have been told that they can't do this and they can't do that. And I sort of wonder, where are you women? Because it certainly wasn't my life. I know I'm not a doctor because I wasn't clever enough.
What does the end state look like? I don't think anyone has ever told me what the end state looks like. And I also agree with the fact that in the boardroom thing, that was the thing that really hit me, is what equality are people fighting for? Is it equality for opportunity, which to me, girls all go to the same schools, you can all go to the same unis, they're getting the same opportunities. But then the analogy I use is, if you trained a load of people to be sprinters, I assume the top 10 sprinters would still be male. So maybe it's not a male-female issue, but I'm saying it might not be the equality that's causing the issue at the top. On top of that, the gender pay gap, I'm not clued up on it exactly, but to my knowledge, every job I've been in, I've been a teacher, and teachers all earn the same regardless of gender. I think nurses are the same, all retail jobs all are the same. So normal jobs that I've witnessed all see this gender pay gap I don't really see. So it seems to be just at the top. So I'm wondering why we're bitching about right up here when most normal people are getting the same amount of money.
Sort of following on from that, a lot of the sort of principles of feminism here seem to be sort of opposed to sort of free market economics and how hard you work equates to how well you do. There seems to be a big problem around maternity leave being really, really damaging. And it seems like it's an issue which hasn't really been solved properly yet, how to adequately reconcile the time spent out of work and how to adequately compensate for that. It seems like a difficult issue which I personally don't know how to reconcile. I was wondering if you had any input on that specifically.
Okay.
I want to address your argument about we've had it better than we've ever had before. As a white middle-class woman, I can say yes, my grouping in society is doing quite well, but there's a reason we're heading into a fourth wave of feminism, and that's feminism hasn't embraced the intersectionality that hasn't become intersectional quite yet, and it needs to. Like, you look at the murder rates of Black trans women, you say we've had it better than we ever had before. Well, white women have it quite good in a lot of aspects, but you need to look at the intersectional aspects because there's a lot of privilege and a lot of internal misogyny to sit there and go, oh, we're doing quite well right now.
I want to just bring a little bit of a historical perspective to this, because the woman at the front, my mother was of a generation where she got a scholarship to go to a college and she became a teacher. When she got married, she had to give the job up. I was told by my quite far-thinking parents, my father said to me, there's probably no point you going to university because you'll get married. So, you know, within that sort of space of those two generations, I then went and worked in the print industry.
What's wrong with that comment?
Hang on, no heckling. Carry on your point.
I'll have that conversation with you later. And we had a team of women who were highly skilled typesetters. So an industry that was male-dominated, women who were highly trained, we sent them to print colleges too. So there was an open office of perhaps 10 typesetting women, and people would come in from the print industry, men, and the proprietor was a man, and we had one male typesetter in mind. And a bloke came in one day and he said, I've got a job, it needs typesetting in Virgin, blah, blah, blah. It needs to be in this point. Is Richard in, who's the proprietor? I said, no, he's Emma. He said, where's Michael? I said, he's got down. And he looked around this room and he said, so nobody here then? And I said, no, only us chickens. What are you going to do? We can't do your job. He said, oh, crap. And I said, it's all right, we understand the language of typesetting. Talk to us. But, you know, we mustn't forget the invisibility of women. And that's what Vicky's been talking about. Is the board, women are largely, very often, invisible because the men that do the selecting choose their own. And most of us choose our own.
Okay.
And I think that that's one of the barriers to women being seen. It's not about women being good enough and therefore they will rise to the top anyway. It just doesn't happen.
Yes. Have final, very short contributions from the floor. Feel free to pick up on anything you like. So, Julie, your final comments, please.
I don't think I've got anything else to say, but it's been very educational.
Succinct. Rebecca.
I would say that basically you either believe that men are better than women or you believe there's a problem. Because if you look at who is in the decision-making roles, then come on, let's look at it. It's pretty much men mostly, isn't it? So if you believe that men are better than women, then that's fine, fuck you. And if you believe that women are as good as men, then you believe there are reasons that they're not getting into these roles. I would say that we have focused quite a lot of the conversation on the boardroom and being in top jobs, and we probably should think about women throughout all stratas of society who are working in the home and outside of the home. I would ask everybody who's talking about maternity leave and pay gap to look up the second shift. It's when women do additional work at home that's unpaid and uncredited. And in conclusion, I would basically just say, I don't think that women talking about the things that hurt them can ever truly be a bad thing. So basically, if you don't want to listen, close your ears.
Okay, thank you. Vicky, your final points.
Yeah, I think it was really moving to hear what people of even my generation had to go through in terms of really no encouragement at all in terms of what we wanted to do. And I think it is worth bearing in mind that a number of the people who asked, surely the women it's the men the people who are good make it to the top, and if it's the men, then so be it. Have still got a bit of a way to go before they realize what actually happens in the workplace. And I think quite a lot of girls who finish school and then go to university, they're told indeed that they can do anything. They tend to choose the wrong subjects sometimes, so they don't learn as much through their lifetimes, but they don't know what's going to hit them when they face either sexism, bias, or they have children. And I have 5 of them. And I have to say, one 26-year-old as well, that for the first 2, I put them down, 1 to studying and 2nd for holiday, to take the time off. And indeed, the amount of work we had to do to get even to this position. And I think, therefore, being a woman matters. I wouldn't have had to have gone through everything I went through if I hadn't been a woman. It would have been considerably easier, frankly, if I had been a man. And going back to the earlier question that was asked there, why do we want to look different? We're not. We can be different. We are the majority. So we're not different. We are the majority, and we should be very proud of that. It doesn't mean that we can't coexist with the others. In fact, the equality, where we're going to end up in the end, if you have more women equally running things at the top, or equally running everything, and being able to work flexibly, have children, share that with their parents, with their partners an awful lot more, then problems at work will be sorted out a lot more easily. So that is where you want to aim for, somewhere where it isn't just the opportunity in terms of what sort of first jobs you can have, but the opportunity throughout your career to be seen to be just as good, or to be just as good as a man, if not better. So the choice at the end, at the top, is one that gives you women to choose from just as much as men, and there's nothing to say. I mean, our current society, if you look at it, if you look at the people at the top, I do not understand why the assumption was made by one of the people in the audience that this must be meritocratic. It must be because the men are better. I find it extraordinary at this day and age. None of my kids would ever say that.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to be very brief. I mean, Vicky, you've made the point I was really itching and desperate to make. I find it perplexing that people would suggest that by having more women in boardrooms and more women in top jobs, there's any relationship between that and a meritocracy, and that the question of women being there is not about their ability, but simply to fill numbers or quotas. The point we're making is, and this gentleman made a really intelligent, helpful point about maternity leave. Very structural and basic issues relating to women being in the workplace and progressing through the workplace are still not resolved. Until we resolve those, women do not get an equal chance to even demonstrate their abilities and get a proper bite at the cherry. So it's not about people being good enough. It's about us giving them the tools so that they can be good enough and demonstrate their full ability. And why should we talk about periods? Because, hey ho, periods are related to maternity. And if we talk about all of that, we talk about our full selves as women. And we then, as I said before, can occupy the space fully as women. And just a final point, very quickly, people are asking about what is the patriarchy? I mean, my question, what do you mean? Do you walk around with your eyes closed? Do you live in society? Or do you know who is in charge of government, the organs of state, and top corporations? You know very well what the patriarchy is. So you take your time to understand it and do what you need to do to create a better society too.
Okay, thank you.
Wow, I don't know how to top that. Last week it was the first all-female spacewalk that occurred on the International Space Station, and the whole world kind of erupted and went, "Whoa, all-female spacewalks!" They went out. No, they didn't free bleed whilst doing it, by the way. But when asked and interviewed for comment, they all just said, I wish we just, this could just be normal, and we could just be treated as normal for this. So that point about normality I really resonate with. To do with the gender pay gap and maternity leave. So I used to work in recruitment, I don't anymore. And we would not give women jobs or shortlist them for jobs if they'd had a gap in their career. And a lot of that time they had been having babies, and it just didn't really occur to somebody. So that correlates with the gender pay gap and progression in careers. yes, biology does need to be a part of it. I think we need to be more open about these things and talk about it. I can talk to my mum about it. I can talk to my housemates about it, my friends. I don't need to tweet about it, and it doesn't need to be all of it. You know, we need to couple it with a narrative of strength. Me Too, I think, has really just created a sort of a collective of suffering, of women saying, look, I'm a victim too, I'm a victim too. Why don't we couple it with some strength and saying what women have done? We're not victims, we are strong. And also, we're not biological creatures. So have some perspective and you know, come on, let's fight it.
Can we thank our speakers? I have a few important announcements, but I just want to say one thing, which is, putting aside my chair's hat for a minute, is that we've heard from brilliant speakers and brilliant contributions. I cannot move for women talking about feminism. It's happening all the time, and issues like periods and things like that are happening on television, they're happening in people's kitchens, they're happening in people's schools. This is something that's quite prevalent, I think you'll agree with me. So take that into consideration when we're talking about stigma or people being silent. It seems to me that the thing that's great about 2019 in relation to women is that you can't shut us up. And I think that is something to be celebrated and to be thought about when it comes to dealing with the issues that women in the future that women might want, which is that we undersell ourselves in terms of our ability to speak up and not get shadowed by mess. And thank you very much. Thank you.